Welcome to Open Church from Zhyve TV. I'm Julian Hayda. Last year, Pope Francis published an apostolic letter called Traditionis Custodes, which restricted the use of the traditional Latin Mass among people who belong to the Roman Catholic Church and follow that Mass. That's the Mass that would have been used before the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. Now, something like that wouldn't normally concern us in the Eastern Catholic churches since we have our own rites and traditions separate from the Roman Catholic Church, but an increasing number of people seem to be seeking out something traditional and have encouraged traditional Latin Mass adherents to look to the East, to join Eastern Catholic churches to get a bit of tradition, something that they recognize, for example, perhaps a different language, the priest facing away from the people, other trappings reminiscent of the old Latin Mass. So we wanted to talk through some of the implications of this, some of the liturgical changes that are happening in the West and what impacts that might have on our church. So joining me now is Dr. Brian Butcher, an adjunct professor at McGill University School of Religious Studies. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory forever, or it's already Christmastide for those of us, Eva Theophany on the new calendar, so we can say Christos Rodaitsia and tomorrow Christos Christaitsia. So
wonderful. It's a great time of the year when so many holidays come together. It's really exciting. Truly happy. It's a happy holidays moment when so many holidays are happening, holy days in our church at the same time. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, from your perspective as a scholar of Eastern Christianity, is that something that from the East is worth paying attention to? How there's almost two separate strains of ritual of Mass happening in our sister Roman Catholic Church?
Yeah, that's a great question, Julian, and I do confess to having spent far too much time following the blogs on this question the last several weeks. And indeed, I'm reviewing a new book that just came out called From Benedict's Peace to Francis's War by Justin Press. And so the topic has very much been on my mind. I think there's a number of points in which Eastern Christians can and should be concerned, and will find that they need to be concerned one way or the other. Let's say that anything that happens in the Latin Church affects us as Eastern Catholics, regardless, simply by dint of the size of the Latin Church vis-a-vis the size of the Eastern Catholic churches. We will always and always have and always will feel the effects of what transpires in the Latin Rite, whether explicitly or implicitly, whether immediately or by way of delayed reaction. In that sense, there's nothing that we can say that in principle should not concern at least some of us, even if all sorts of things don't need to be pondered by any number of people on a day-to-day basis. We have seen this historically in the way in which, for example, very notoriously, the concern for unity in the Latin Rite in the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries led to the exclusion of married clergy from North America with Cum Data Fuerit and earlier and later documentation, because ostensibly Roman Catholics who were already divided along ethnic and linguistic lines, German, Polish, Italian, and so forth, felt that to consolidate their unity, the last thing they needed was to be distracted or have their people be confused by so-called Catholics following not only a different liturgical tradition, but observing a different ecclesiastical discipline. And as few in number as Eastern Catholics were at that time in the United States, nonetheless, that difference was seen as a threat by many of the, in the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. And so difference is always going to be a challenge. One can say that it's never been obvious in the history of the church how you can have unity without uniformity and diversity without division. One person's idea of diversity becomes another person's idea of something that is in fact a source of division. One person's idea of what's required for unity translates into another person's experience of uniformity or homogeneity. Which is why, in my estimation, this is such an important question, such an important moment in the Latin Church's history, but indeed the worldwide Church's history. Because what happens in the Latin Church doesn't only affect us as Eastern Catholics, it certainly does also affect Orthodox and Protestants and others. And we have had a pontificate in which there has been such a startling variety of initiatives, many of them which, at least at first glance, seem to be without precedent, And we're in the midst of a process ostensibly dedicated to synodality, which suffers from many definitions, but at least one of which includes the idea of consulting people, accompanying people, catering to the very diversity and variety of people's interests, inclinations, life experiences, and so forth. That this recent, and I think we can call it a bombshell from the Vatican, it seems to be, in fact, in my estimation, entirely at odds with the thrust of the papacy, of Pope Francis as a whole, and with what he is on record saying and teaching in practically every other sphere. And so it's almost like the acme or the sort of culmination of a long-standing, a long-simmering malaise in the Latin Church, in which how exactly unity and uniformity, diversity and division, centralized leadership in the form of the papacy, and the devolution or derogation to the local bishops and bishops' conferences, which was one of the cardinal teachings of the Second Vatican Council, which is meant to decentralize the authority of the church, how these contrary dynamics are to be sort of held in creative and healthy tension.
Yeah, because for sake of clarity, for people who might have been not have been following this so closely, the Congregation for Divine Worship, the Vatican office, they basically require the people who want to celebrate the pre-1960s Latin Mass ask for all sorts of permission that perhaps was decided more locally before a few months ago, and now they need to really kind of run it up the chain of command more than they would have before to have a Latin Mass.
More egregious than that, since for the past 13 years, Pope Benedict, in his Summorum Pontificum, declared that that every priest had the inalienable right to celebrate the traditional rites of the Latin Church in virtue of his ordination. So you've gone from one extreme to another, one extreme that put the authority into the hands of an individual presbyter, if he would like to celebrate the Mass, and according to the traditional books, and other sacraments as well, confession, anointing of the sick, and so forth, sacraments that are obviously within his purview. And bishops had the right to use the pontificales, so for ordinations and confirmations and blessings which are reserved to bishops, that kind of thing. And you have Pope Benedict teaching that the extraordinary form, so-called, is of perpetual value in the church. What previous generations, to quote Pope Benedict, what previous generations have held sacred cannot not be held sacred by us, much less declared harmful or forbidden. So you have what is as close to a magisterial teaching as one can get on the part of Pope Benedict, basically because he allies his own teaching with that of previous pontiffs, such as Pius V, in the wake of the Council of Trent, declaring that the Tridentine form was the perennial and the perfect expression of the faith of the Latin Church, and should be and was to be celebrated in perpetuity. So the only way to make sense of that is that the church, as the Coptic Christians are wont to say, the church can add, but it can't take away. Because if you take away, you're cutting off the branch on which you sit, right? To do justice to what previous popes and councils have said, in other words, to have a coherent theology of history and of the magisterium throughout time, you can't resort to a positivism that says, well, this pope says this, but now we have this pope and he says that, which makes it sound as if the truth of the faith and the substance of our devotion are simply decided positivistically, like by fiat, and that one day it changes depending on the regime, which would suggest that these things have no value in and of themselves. And there are some people who think like that think that being a Catholic means the Pope says jump and you say how high. But this is in fact very difficult to square with any of the historic teaching about the nature of the papal office, whose job is to in fact preserve the tradition of the church, sustain, support, guard, and protect it, rather than to determine it. And that's where I think in Eastern Christian we owe it to our fellow Catholics as people who know what it's like to have our tradition taken away from us, to be suppressed as a church, the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, to have our liturgies marginalized in the past by Roman Catholics, by being Latinized, who said, no, this isn't really what's on board, this isn't acceptable. That we have been through that experience of being forced to display unity through a kind of uniformity, that we should have a sympathy now for our brothers and sisters who love the traditional Latin rite, who we've gone from being, we've been Latinized, and now they're basically trying to get rid of Latinization, so to speak. In other words, they're not interested in Latinizing Eastern Catholics. They don't even want Roman Catholics to be Latinized anymore.
So it seems like the crux of the situation here is more a matter of church power, of church authority, of the jurisdiction of bishops over their faithful. And the question of synodality, which you mentioned earlier, is, I think, pretty important to this. I was reading in the National Catholic Register a quote from Cardinal Walter Casper, who many of Eastern Catholics know and Eastern Orthodox know as being formerly the head of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. A lot of Orthodox conversations that happened under his watch. And he said that adherents of the traditional Latin Mass tend to reject the Second Vatican Council outright, that it's not only about the Mass, but it's about the Second Vatican Council. Now, our church, the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church and other Eastern Catholic churches, it's been said, owe their existence to the Second Vatican Council, because the Second Vatican Council said that we are to restore our traditions to a time before they perhaps were Latinized. And so is there a certain irony that perhaps you can comment on the fact that we Eastern Catholics embrace Vatican II because it allows us to be who we are? It allowed us to, for example, return to a tradition that had been slowly deteriorating over the course of a few hundred years. And yet at the same time, there seems to be some kind of distaste with the Second Vatican Council overall, because it led to this split among the usages of the Mass, a new Mass, and increasingly restricts the pre-Vatican II Mass. How are we supposed to kind of understand that apparent irony there?
Are there people who explicitly oppose the Second Vatican Council? Of course there are, and you can find them in the blogosphere, which magnifies the voices of one person to make it rather quite loud. But the vast majority of people who are faithful to the traditional Latin Mass within the Catholic Church are there for a reason. They could have gone to the Society of Pius X or to the Society of Pius V, the Sede Vacantis, if they didn't believe in the validity of the hierarchy and the sacraments of the Latin Church. These are
people who, for people who don't know those terms, these are people who reject even the current authority of the Roman Church and believe that the seat is vacant. That's what Sede Vacantis.
Well, so the Society of Pius V believes that the pontificate is effectively vacant. The Society of Pius X believes rather that there are issues that they need to be in schism until things are sorted out with respect to a proper to their own doctrinal questions about how the Second Vatican Council's teachings are to be received. They do not deny that Pope Francis is legitimate Pope, And ironically, Pope Francis has granted those people, and it was this priests and brothers, the community of monks and nuns as well, who celebrate exclusively the extraordinary form, and they are not in full communion right now with the Latin Church. He's granted them full faculties to recognize their jurisdiction, we say, to hear confessions and celebrate marriages and so forth. So the idea that these people who've made sacrifices in order to become reintegrated into the main body of the Latin Church don't accept the council is, to me, ludicrous, because they really wanted to display their opposition. They could have gone another direction. They could have, frankly, become Orthodox. And ironically, if you are a Western Rite Orthodox who celebrates the Latin Mass, you're probably more likely to, you at this point in time, will get greater respect from Pope Francis than if you are from the Fraternity St. Peter, because in the name of ecumenism, Catholics are obliged to recognize the apostolicity of the Orthodox churches and the validity of their sacraments, which includes the Western Rite of the Orthodox Church, which is existent in France and in England, Britain, and in the US, which includes former Anglicans, Lutherans, and many former Roman Catholics. And many of them celebrate what's called they call the Rite of St. Peter or St. Gregory, which is the extraordinary form of the Mass in English or other languages, and sometimes in Latin as well. So you have Pope Francis not only saying, for example, going to the Orthodox, saying that we have to renew our bonds and recognize how close we are and so forth. You're saying, okay, so with them, you realize that diversity is a strength. They are very different. They have these age-old rites which have not been reformed according to the prescriptions of Sacrosanctum Concilium, and yet you are eager to have communion with them. He goes to Abu Dhabi and signs a document saying that God wills religious diversity, to the point that Islam and Christianity, according to the prima facie reading of the document, are two ways in which God calls people to himself. This is, a very controversial document because never before, John Paul II had kissed a Quran and had prayer for peace at Assisi and so forth, but never before had a pope sort of said explicitly that God wills diversity in the sense that maybe it's actually good, not just allowable, good that Muslims be Muslim and Christian be Christian. So you have a pope who's basically gone as far towards affirming the dignity of other religions as possible, but meanwhile can't tolerate diversity in his own backyard. Ironically, a diversity which always existed in the Latin West. Not only was there the Ambrosian Rite in Milan, the Mozarabic Rite in Toledo, but the Carthusians, the Dominicans, the Norbertines, the Carmelites, all had their own form of the Mass and their own form of the divine office. And now we have the Rite of Zaire since Vatican II in Congo and the Anglican Ordinariate. So the whole thrust of tradition is that there has been diversity within unity, and that diversity is in fact the only way that Christian unity is in fact itself. Just as God cannot be made into one, you can't get rid of the three persons in the name of the one God. And so it's true that after Trent there was a standardization. But even there, with great fear and trembling, Pius V said that any rite that had a continuous use of at least 200 years, it didn't even have to go back to the 4th century, if it had even existed from the Middle Ages on, had to be respected out in the name of preserving what the Holy Spirit had done within the church. Then they wanted to rule out new forms of Protestant services that didn't have a pedigree, but they were very careful to respect any plants, shall we say, any endangered species. And if one were to look, at the Catholic Church today, I think as a sympathetic inquirer and say, an Orthodox were to say, so if we come back into communion, can we trust that our traditions will be respected? The easiest way to answer that is to say, well, of course we respect your tradition because we respect our own. But people are going to find it hard to believe that you can care about my 4th century liturgy if you can't care about the 4th century liturgy and traditions that have existed, in your house all this time. And in fact, not only do you add to them, which is okay, you can put on new rooms into your house, but now you smash down the walls of the old house, or you blockade the entrance and say no one can go in the attic anymore. No one can see anything that's up there. You must all live within the living room and only move around within this very confined space. You can add something new, and if the people of God as a whole, for whatever reason, embrace it, by and large, that's fine. If, in fact, the people reject it, it will die of its own accord. That the hierarchy has to persecute it into the ground. Reminds me of when the Russian Orthodox persecuted the old believers, and that did not end well. This was, again, a liturgical reform in the name of, hey, everyone, we've decided we have to update, get with the program, and all of you strange people who cross yourself like this or sing like that, we don't care, you have to kind of conform. People willing to be burned at the stake for that. And the old believers are still around today. And now, finally, the Russian Orthodox are actually appreciating them. And you have conferences with these people where they're like, what can we learn from old believers? What's the charism, the spirituality of the old believers, all of the musical riches, the devotional riches they have, and so forth. So here's a name of kind of like just like diversity, which is a watchword, and inclusion in our age. This action seems to be completely going against that. And of course, everything that Pope Francis talks about accompaniment, discernment, listening, dialogue, avoiding rigidity, being gentle, etc. All of that wonderful talk, this is a case in point where it needs to be, in fact, enacted.
It's interesting you mention the old believers, the Orthodox old believers, because it seems like, you know, it depends on where people look back towards tradition, where that tradition, at what point in history, what era is the most authentic, is the most traditional. And so, you know, there are people in Ukraine, there are people outside of Ukraine who in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church look to the 19th century or even the 18th century and the Synod of Zamość and say, hey, our authentic Byzantine tradition, you know, has Corpus Christi, it has statues, it has, you know, different customs, traditions that are either Latin in origin or are just not at all found in Byzantium, and people want that. So they feel that they are vindicated. They feel that they are defending their tradition, the tradition passed down to them by their parents and grandparents. Yeah. And many of them are willing to be persecuted in the name of anti-Latinization in our church, in defense of a tradition that they don't recognize themselves.
No, you're spot on there. And this is a messy business, don't get me wrong. There may not be an easy solution, but when there's no easy solution, you certainly don't pretend that there's an easy solution by just marginalizing people or outlawing things. Obviously, I'm a child of the Traditionis Institute, and as you said, the Second Vatican Council, I think we should not have low mass. We should not say the filioque. It should be a no-brainer that married and celibate clergy are both acceptable. That in our church that we should have an iconostas, that we should have a curtain, that we should have the liturgy of the hours, that should be presanctified. And I mean, you and I would understand like what was the basic grammar of the Byzantine tradition is like the grammar of a language. That even if there's a regional dialect that's a bit strange, there is nonetheless a sense of what the mainstream language is, right? I was quite happy to be corrected when I was studying in Ukraine, when I was studying Ukrainian, about words that I might have used that I picked up in Canada. And they said to me, well, that's not proper Ukrainian. Strangely enough, I came back to Canada and people were correcting me in my parish here saying, where do you get that word from? That's not proper Ukrainian. I was like, who do you listen to? You know, but so it is messy. It's a work in progress. You have to be gentle. What you certainly can't do is bang people over the head with a typicon of one kind or another. So if somebody remains attached to the rosary or to statues or to recited liturgy, whatever, you don't demonize them. For goodness sake, they're praying, right? I mean, like, and are you to say that they're not worshiping God? But we nonetheless can study our tradition. We can study those who share our tradition. We can look at the theology behind these practices. And it's quite possible to document where and how and why these practices came in. We can evaluate them calmly, dispassionately, and say, while this may have come in, came in, maybe served a purpose. It was greatly appreciated by people at the time, but now putting in a larger context, you can realize it's less than ideal, and we can encourage people and the clergy to move towards that. And a good bishop will be firm, but also gentle and accommodating, right? So similarly, I think the traditional Latin Mass can develop. Indeed, I would argue that the reform envisioned by the fathers of Vatican II was precisely along these lines, that the extraordinary form would be retained by and large, but there would be increased use of the vernacular, communion under both species on occasion, and various other, openness to new forms of art or music or what have you. But that what is envisioned in Sacrosanctum Concilium and in the other documents of Vatican II does not in fact correspond in many respects to what was ended up being done in the name of the council. And that makes some people uncomfortable. The idea, well, did God somehow cease guiding the church such that it didn't follow the council the way it should have? Well, if we actually look at the other councils in church history, I think we have to soberly realize that very often people get in God's way. And the idea that one makes the Second Vatican Council a sine qua non for adherents of faith, to me, is ludicrous, because the Second Vatican Council itself teaches that the Orthodox churches have fully valid episcopates and sacraments and guide their people to salvation, even though they do they accept Vatican II? No. Or Vatican I? No. Or any of the 14 councils since 787. So if the Orthodox don't have to accept 14 ecumenical councils, and they explicitly don't accept them, then why on earth can you say that these Catholics, who might have difficulty with certain interpretations of certain documents, which they've only had 50 years to digest, that somehow now all of a sudden it's necessary that they do this? Necessary what, for salvation? Clearly not. Otherwise, it wouldn't, what that same council says about other Christians, including Protestants, by the way, wouldn't apply. So to me, there's just a jumble of contradictions and dangers here, and I just see it as a very unnecessary and unhealthy developments in the Latin Church, and that unfortunately will affect all of us.
So I have one final question, and that is advice for the people in the Latin Church who might be looking east. Some people say that they're refugees when they leave the Latin Church and attempt to join one of the Eastern Catholic churches. Obviously, we don't want to, proselytize. We don't want to necessarily take people away from their own church. What advice do you have to people? Can they, for example, take their devotions that they came to appreciate and just apply them to the Eastern Catholic Church that they might start attending? Or should they, continue sticking with it in their own church and trying to make it work?
Yeah, I mean, look, this one of the cardinal teachings of the Second Vatican Council is about the primacy of conscience, right? And that's very easily abused because often it's spoken about without the corollary teaching about the need to tutor your conscience, right? But it goes hand in hand with the teaching of the Vatican II about religious liberty. That whereas much of history would give the impression that the Catholic Church was not very supportive of religious liberty, we've actually made that a part and parcel of our formal teaching now, that nobody should be coerced to believe anything. So people who are, for reasons of conscience, we don't go looking for, people from the Latin Church to say, hey, come here. Exactly as you said, we're not poaching from other parishes. But just as there are many, many Ukrainians and Arabs, Melkites and others who, for all sorts of reasons, marriage, family, job, location, whatnot, find themselves going to a Roman Catholic parish, finding themselves at home, finding that it nourishes their faith, we should not remonstrate these people or castigate them for finding God there, I don't think. And I don't think either that we should reject anyone who comes to an Eastern church. There are people who have been, for many years now, coming to our church from Roman Catholic context, sometimes because they fall in love with the Byzantine tradition, sometimes because, as you say, they're refugees from abuses in the Latin Rite, and those predate these current restrictions that we're speaking of. But it's true that there may be more people who come now if access to a traditional Latin Mass is cut off for them and they don't want to go to ordinary Reformed parish, they may come. And it's going to be a learning curve for both sides, right? Because somebody who comes in to our tradition from the extraordinary form is going to be say, oh, great. So, nobody touches the host except the priest, right? And the deacon. So I can trust that no one's not, I'm going to be receiving communion in a reverent manner. It's on the spoon, but I'm not taking it in my hands, etc. Okay, good. So they're comfortable with that. Oh, but wait, you guys stand where you used to kneeling. Oh, okay, that's a bit weird. Or you do this and we do this, right? So there will be a kind of an adjustment, just like moving to any country or learning another language. But I think if you pay attention, see, for me personally, I sing sometimes at the extraordinary form. I'm friends with one of the assistant choir mistress there. And after Traditionis Custodes came out, I said to her, listen, anytime you need me, I'm there for you. I'll sing for anything that I can, because I just want to support them. I just said, like love from the East, like, and whenever but see, it's actually not me giving, because whenever I go sing for a high mass or solemn mass at the Traditionis Forum, I end up learning something. Invariably, I notice something that helps me better understand something in my own tradition. And I think comparative linguistics is a good model for this, that nobody would say that you are a worse English speaker because you've gone and learned Spanish or French or Latin or Ukrainian. Invariably, you speak your own language better because you understand language better. You understand the nature of grammar, what's essential in all languages, what's accidental, how different languages work, and the genius of each language. You understand the roots of words that have been borrowed, and the way different languages have completely different idioms or proverbs, to capture a certain experience. And so I think it can be a very mutually enriching thing that when someone from the Extraordinary Form comes to the Byzantine liturgy, I saw there's a great article on this that talked about the Byzantine and the Extraordinary Form as two brothers, that they're different, but they share a common DNA, because all the apostolic liturgies do go back to the early apostolic and sub-apostolic tradition, and they all crystallize more or less in the 4th century. And so someone who pays attention to the deep structure of our tradition will find it very nourishing. And they don't need to think that it either has to resemble the Extraordinary Form to become identical to it, nor that it has to be Latinized, nor that they themselves should think that everything that we do is somehow intrinsically better. It's just different. And you spend you're going to be living in Ukraine for a while. You may admire many things about Ukrainian culture and food and whatnot, and you may find some things to be better than the US, some things to be worse, and something just to be different, right? And I think that's the experience that that's the mentality we should bring. We should always be grateful if we can go to any apostolic liturgy anywhere, frankly, and in this day and age, under COVID especially, anywhere you can worship the Lord and receive the sacraments, you should be grateful for that. And you should rightly expect that any place follow its own intrinsic logic. So if I'm speaking with Ukrainians, it's normal to expect that they use proper grammar when speaking with me, so that I can learn their language. And similarly, when I go to the Extraordinary Form, I'm aware of the rubrics, and I will notice if they're not following it. Generally, they do. And it might be that we could use a shot in the arm, like someone from comes to the Extraordinary Form says, "Hey, I read you guys are supposed to be like serving pre-sanctified in the weekdays of Lent," and that makes us think, "Oh, well, actually, we are. We're not doing that here." And yeah, thanks for pointing that out. We know we're supposed to do that. We're just a little bit lazy on that front, or something like that, right? So it may be that the so-called outsider ends up helping us better understand and perhaps better implement our own tradition. And that maybe with that kind of presence of the outsider is the very leaven in the dough that we might need. So perhaps the blessings will go both ways. And maybe when those people in time, because I do believe another pope will come along eventually who will overturn this action of Pope Francis, when those people find their way back to the Extraordinary Form, because if you're grounded in a tradition, usually you want to raise your kids and pass it on to them, right? So you might just sojourn for a while. So when those people go back, they will bring back with them perhaps a greater respect and appreciation for the East, which will help temper some of the tensions that we've experienced historically as Eastern Catholics, where Roman Catholics didn't understand us, or were discriminating against us, as we've already spoken about that. So it might just be a blessing in disguise that things are shaken up, such that when they settle again, there will be greater respect all around. Someone in the Extraordinary Form said, "I never realized who those Eastern Catholics were. And now not only do I understand them, but I've really been blessed I've received so much being with them." And as I say, in my case, I've been really blessed to grow as a Christian, as a liturgist, as a scholar by my friends in the Extraordinary Form, as a musician, and I feel like it's you can, the church is so full of richness. One lifetime is not enough to explore all of this, and anywhere you can grow in your knowledge of the faith and the church is going to be a blessing for you and for those with whom you find yourself.
Well, yes, indeed. It's always amazing to learn. We're so blessed, especially in North America, that we can visit so many different churches in our neighborhoods and meet so many different people. Thanks so much, Professor Brian Butcher, for joining us on Zhyve TV today and discussing the Latin Mass and our Eastern Catholic churches.
Very good. Have a wonderful holiday.
Christ
and
is born.
look forward to seeing you serving as a priest, hopefully back in North America. We need you. Okay.
I'll be back. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Take care. Bye-bye.